Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program on homegrown hate and domestic terrorism. My name is Robert Pine. I'm director of the Norman Miller Center for Peace, Justice, and Public Understanding at St. Norbert College. We're pleased to be co-sponsoring tonight's program together with the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and our partner organization from Madison, We Are Many United Against Hate, under the direction of our friend Masood Akhtar. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jim Handley from UW-Stout, the executive director of the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. Jim?
Thank you. First, we would like to, we recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations that reside within the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. They're the traditional custodians of this land. We acknowledge the circumstances that led to their forced removal and honor their history of resistance and resilience. The First Nations residing within the boundaries of present-day Wisconsin remain vibrant and strong. Good evening, I'm Jim Handley, the executive director of the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, a proud co-sponsor of this event. The Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies is an organization of universities and colleges dedicated to promoting an informed understanding of peace, justice, and conflict reconciliation, and to creating and supporting an education system that intentionally and thoughtfully prepares our students to make positive impacts in their communities. Colleges and universities across the state have made a commitment to helping create communities rooted in peace, justice, nonviolence, and sustainability. By joining our organization, these educational institutions are taking seriously their responsibility in creating positive social change and dismantling systems of oppression. The Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies firmly believes that by working together, our institutional members and their respective students will make a significant contribution to making our communities more just, more inclusive, and more peaceful. Discussions like we're about to have play a critical role in the type of education that will help people acquire the knowledge and skills to create peace. Again, on behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, welcome to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. So this evening, we're going to have opportunity to hear from Daryl Johnson, one of our nation's foremost experts on domestic terrorism. Before we hear from Daryl, we are going to have, I'm sorry, say that again. After we hear from Daryl, we'll have opportunity to interact with him together with a panel. We have joining us political science professors, Dr. Wendy Scattergood and Dr. Angel Saavedra Cisneros, along with a panel of students from St. Norbert College. So again, Daryl Johnson is a counterterrorism analyst for the US government, ultimately was lead analyst for domestic terrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. He's the author of Hateland, A Long Hard Look at America's Extremist Heart, and also Right-Wing Resurgence, How a Domestic Terrorist Threat is Being Ignored. Since the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, he has been a frequent guest on national news. He's one observer who might not have been as surprised as the rest of us by the events that unfolded in Washington on that day. Again, after his opening remarks, we'll be joined by our panelists. We'll have opportunity for questions, and you all as participants will have opportunity to send questions to us by means of the chat feature on the webinar. So we ask that you take your time in formulating those questions, send them in by chat, and then we'll ask them of Daryl after he's finished with his presentation. So Daryl Johnson, thank you so much. Welcome, and we're very glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Robert. And one of the things I'd like to do to start off this presentation is to show a quick video which will give everyone a better understanding as to how we arrived at this point in our nation's history this year with the Capitol insurrection. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and start by showing this quick video, and then we'll get into my presentation.
Panic and fear ripped through the parking lot of the Jewish Community Center this afternoon.
There's a guy with a rifle here shooting at people.
The number of reported hate crimes in the United States is on the rise for a third year in a row.
From the shooting deaths of 2 African Americans at a Kentucky supermarket to the killing of 11 worshipers at a Pittsburgh synagogue.
It was a meme for the midterms on a website visited more than 2.5 million times a month. Us If We Lose, depicting white men ready for war, followed by Them If We Win, showing Jews being led to their death. This is a race war, period.
I stand before you today to announce my candidacy for President of the United States of America.
January 2007, I got a call from the U.S. Capitol Police contact who asked us to monitor extremist chatter related to Barack Obama and his candidacy for president. We started seeing a lot of threats, dozens of things that we were finding and submitting to the Secret Service. Typically, in a given year, we would see a few thousand people join Stormfront, which is the largest white supremacist gathering place on the internet. But in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 election, the website had doubled from like 60,000 users to 120,000. In 2007, there was less than 100 militia groups. By 2008, there was like 150. In the intelligence and law enforcement community, there's a huge disproportionate emphasis on Muslim extremism and threats from overseas. So the Department of Homeland Security knew that they had a blind spot. The purpose and intent of the 2009 right-wing extremism report from Homeland Security was to send out a warning to state and local law enforcement that we're seeing a shift in the threat environment from Al-Qaeda to domestic, homegrown terrorists. We felt that we were in a good position and that we'd be ahead of the wave and be able to provide some sort of indication and warning. The report was issued to law enforcement, and within a few days it had leaked, and I came into work the very next week to utter chaos in the office.
Outrage tonight over an intelligence report.
Political conservatives are fired up.
This is an effort to criminalize political dissent.
Now, if you disagree with that liberal path that President Obama's taken the country down, you may soon catch the attention of the Department of Homeland Security.
It says groups dedicated to a single issue, such as opposition to abortion or immigration, may fall within the definition of extremist.
Does that mean they're going to be sending spies to these tea parties?
Someone obviously didn't agree with the term right-wing extremism. This is a legitimate term in the counterterrorism community. The FBI used it.
This is an ideology-based assessment that basically takes conservatives and say, we are looking out at you.
A few months before the 2009 right-wing extremism report, we actually had a report on left-wing extremism, and yet nobody raised any complaints or got offended by it. We gave warning ahead of an actual threat that turned out to be true.
Several high-profile violent crimes have gripped the nation these past few months.
There's a lot of issues at play when it comes to politics and why politicians avoid this issue.
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay?
He knows exactly who David Duke is. He was asked this morning 2 times, will you repudiate and condemn the Ku Klux Klan? And he refused to do that as well.
Typically under Republican administrations, we see a dial back in far-right extremism because They feel that Republican administrations are more pro-gun. They're not going to be extending rights to minority groups, things like this. But this Trump administration bucks the trend that I've seen over the past 4 decades. It's basically mainstreamed the extremist message, and they are getting emboldened by it. Homeland Security has over 250,000 employees. No one is looking at domestic terrorism.
A white nationalist rising threat around the world. I don't really. I think it's a small group of people.
It all starts with acknowledging the threat exists. Okay, so that brings us up to pretty much 2019. If anyone's interested in my career, I've done close to 400 media interviews. You can just Google my name simply, put in Daryl Johnson, expert or domestic terrorism. You can read all about my background and beliefs. Just for the record and for everyone that's here today, for most of my life, I've been a conservative. I'm a 3rd generation registered Republican. I was raised in the Mormon religion, which was a very conservative religious environment. And so, you know, for people to really take that into consideration and realize that I had the courage and the, you know, wherewithal to call out this threat, I wish our same political leaders would do the same and follow my lead. So the events of January 6th kind of rocked the nation and brought this terrorist problem of violent right-wing extremism to the forefront. And a lot of people were shocked at the events that happened that day. What's important for everyone to know is that was not the culmination or the final chapter of a dying movement. It's actually symbolic of a new phase, more dangerous and violent phase that we're now entering with right-wing extremism. So don't be lured into the false notion that, you know, this big protest that we had that turned violent and insurrectionist was the kind of the crescendo or the final act. It is not. It's just ushering in a new phase of this problem. I've broken down today's presentation into 4 segments. I'm going to give you a quick domestic terrorism 101, talking about all the types of extremist movements we have here and their types of activities. And then we'll go into what's happened recently with these types of groups, particularly at the far right presence at the recent anti-racism protests. We'll go into a forecast and an update, and then finally we'll end with some recommendations. So as far as domestic terrorism, the first thing you need to realize is that these groups and their strategies and tactics differ significantly from what we see from foreign terrorist organizations. So there's no hierarchical structure. There's no Osama bin Laden of domestic terrorism. These are loosely lit movements that have spokespersons, if you will, that call attention to certain issues or call attention to targets that they would like to exploit and avenge their grievances against. They operate according to the tactics of lone offenders, small cells, and leaderless resistance. And what this means is that people do not go to a training camp and learn the art of bomb making like you would in a foreign terrorist group. They self-train. They go on the internet. They download bomb making manuals. They practice in their backyards. And so, you know, this is a particularly difficult thing for law enforcement and intelligence to basically identify, assess, and prevent, because these people are operating autonomously. The other thing you need to understand is these small cells and violent lone offenders, they're continuing their attacks practically on a regular recurring basis. And for the longest time, their attacks have been somewhat isolated and small in scale. And so a lot of times our media, our political leaders, and even law enforcement do not call these acts terrorism because it kind of lacks that symbolic, high body count type of characteristic. But nevertheless, this is ideologically motivated violence, which meets the definition of terrorism. The other thing that I've noticed in 40 years of looking at this subject is that typically domestic terrorism operates in cycles depending on what type of administration is in power, the politics and social issues that are being discussed in the media. And so looking at these cycles, typically we see the far right being increased in activity and more agitated and conducting violent attacks during Democratic administrations. If you look back at history, some of the bigger terrorist attacks like Oklahoma City bombing happened under the Clinton administration. Prior to that, there was a lot of bank robberies and bombings and killings when Jimmy Carter was president. And then when Republicans are in power, we typically see the far left getting more agitated and more active. So environmental eco-terrorists, animal rights, violent animal rights groups, these violent black bloc anarchists, and now Antifa. So we've seen these cyclical terrorism cycles that have occurred decade after decade after decade. So what was interesting in 2016 is for the very first time, at least in my lifetime, we had a Republican administration that came into power and actually pandered to these groups and encouraged them through, not only policies that were being proposed and implemented, like building a border wall, travel bans on Muslims, deportation of immigrants, and slowing down the immigration process. These are things that I saw and heard of on white supremacist, KKK, neo-Nazi websites 15, 20 years ago when I was looking at this subject in the beginning. And now they're being endorsed as policy. We had an administration that minimized this problem, called them very fine people, called them special, told them to stand by and wait for the president's command to activate and to do things. And so it's important for you to understand that these growth and the ebb and flow of these extremist movements are oftentimes tied into political cycles and political administrations. So just to mention some of the high-profile attacks that we've had by right-wing extremists, we've had the mass shooting at the Walmart in El Paso, the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. We have other mass shootings in Dayton and Gilroy involving people that were either misogynistic or anti-immigrant. We had the package bomb scare back in the midterm elections of 2018. So these lone offenders, the difficult thing is trying to identify and assess and disrupt their activities. On the other hand, because they lack the operational skills and the training that some of the foreign terrorist organizations have, oftentimes, their attacks are not as lethal. They may have a failure of an explosive device to go off, or maybe, they lack the proficiency as a marksman to kill enough people or what have you. So there's this little trade-off. They're trading off secrecy and anonymity to be able to strike out with little notice or detection for the sensational types of attacks that we've seen in Europe and other places by foreign terrorists. So let's briefly break down how the FBI, Homeland Security, and others look at domestic terrorism. So if you look at the political spectrum, we have the far right and the far left. And on the far right, we have two huge umbrella movements that comprise pretty much all of the domestic terrorism from the far right. And that is the white supremacy movement and the anti-government movement. Within these two broad movements, we have sub-movements. So under white supremacy, you have KKK factions, neo-Nazi groups, racist skinhead gangs, Aryan prison gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs that are white supremacists. We also have a racist religion called Christian Identity, which believes the whites are the true Israelites and not the Jews in Israel. Under anti-government groups, we have a couple of different components to it. We have the paramilitary aspect, these armed militia extremists. We also have what's called sovereign citizens. These are people that have renounced their citizenship. They do not obey our laws. They don't recognize government regulations. They don't pay their taxes. We also have bigger movements outside of the far right that kind of influence these extremist movements, such as conspiracy theories. We also have other anti-government sentiments embraced by other groups. And more recently, we've had the formation of these armed vigilante groups that aren't quite militias, but they're more of these armed posses that are, being led by these conspiracy theories and disinformation that's emerged. On the far left, we have anarchist extremists. Some of you might be familiar with some of the property destruction that they've caused at economic summits as well as political conventions. They have the so-called Black Bloc, which are these violent anarchists that are clad in black clothing and wear masks. They engage primarily in property destruction and violence against the police. We also have Black nationalists. This is a much smaller movement than white supremacy. Just in comparison, white supremacy movement here in the United States numbers in the hundreds of thousands of adherents, including hardcore members of these various hate groups I've described, as well as their supporters and sympathizers. Black nationalism is probably in the single thousands, 5,000, 7,000 range. And then we have a new movement that formed around 2017 called Antifa. This stands for anti-fascists, and they are primarily looking at counter-protesting the white nationalists and instigating street brawls and things of this nature, as well as property destruction. The last category of domestic extremists that engage in acts of terrorism are called single-issue extremists. They could be both on the far right or far left. We're talking about groups on the far right that are male supremacist incel extremists, which stands for involuntary celibate. These extremists have emerged more recently, have conducted mass shootings and vehicle ramming attacks against women and others that support women's rights. We also have violent anti-abortion extremists. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the assassinations of abortion doctors, as well as arsons and bombings of abortion clinics in America. And then we also have violent tax resistors. These are people that don't pay their taxes, but they also attack the IRS and issue all kinds of threats related to taxation. And then finally, on the far left, the single issue extremists we find there are your environmental rights extremists and violent animal rights extremists. So these are people like adherents of the Animal Liberation Front, Earth Liberation Front. So you need to understand there's also some social political issues today that continues to fuel the growth of these movements, particularly on the far right. We talked about how in 2008, the unprecedented election of an African-American president coupled with the economic downturn created this fertile environment of people that could be easily susceptible to extremist recruitment to the militias and anti-government groups, as well as the white supremacists. Today, we have a pandemic. And how this affects the anti-government groups' recruitment and radicalization strategies is we have government-issued mandates that they look at as infringements on their constitutional rights. such as, mandates to wear masks in public, or limiting the group size at a gathering, or shutting down businesses. So they look at all of that as infringements on their rights. And as you probably recalled last year, there were many anti-lockdown protests where these same people that you saw at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, with their rifles, with their Trump flags, with their Gadsden Amendment flags, talking about this, pandemic or this fake illness that's going around the country. And they think it's just completely fabricated and orchestrated by this government that wants to infringe on our rights and control us. And then you have the economic downturn associated with the pandemic. So that puts more people unemployed. They're at home. They're surfing the internet. They're coming into contact with extremist propaganda online, and they're joining up with these causes. The 2020 social injustice protests also created a nice backdrop for many of these anti-government groups who have been calling and preparing for an actual civil war. And seeing the looting and the burning and the rioting that was going on in major cities in the US, these militia groups went into these hot zones with their rifles, with their tactical gear, with their military helmets, under the guise or ruse of protecting business owners, but observing all of this inner city violence firsthand, which kind of served as a radicalization node of this notion of a coming civil war. And so they've been preparing. They've been stockpiling arms, buying up, hoarding ammunition, and waiting for this impending civil war. And then the final thing is the misinformation and disinformation that surrounded the 2020 U.S. national election and the aftermath. We had the former president of the United States make these false allegations that there was rampant voter fraud, that the election was rigged, that our electoral process was corrupt. And unfortunately, despite him leaving office, there are a lot of people that still believe that that's true. And so we're going to continue to experience the effects of that false notion and how these people have been radicalized around that notion of a false election. So why am I so concerned about the far right? We're going to talk about the far left just to give you kind of a balanced approach and to show that I'm objective in my analysis. But the comparison between these two extremist spectrums, currently, there's really no comparison. We're talking about apples and oranges. The far right has consistently shown decade after decade their propensity for violence against people. I'm talking about bombings that have killed people, mass shootings that have killed people, assassination plots and attempts, things of this nature. The far left, in contrast, is primarily focused on property destruction. Yes, there was billions of dollars of damage during these riots. A vast majority of that was criminal in nature. The FBI did open over 600 domestic terrorism investigations in the summer of 2020, and they're still investigating those. So we're still kind of, the jury's out as far as how many far left extremists were participating in the looting and the burning and all the other crime and violence that happened around the social injustice protests. But as far as the far right, I can tell you this. They are armed to the hilt. They possess the capability to inflict mass casualties type of producing attacks. I'm also very concerned about the amount of disinformation that's being fed to the far right regarding election fraud, involving fake allegations of Antifa leaving the inner cities and going out to rural America to loot and set fire to these small towns. That scares a lot of people. They've also been the primary aggressors in a lot of the agitated harassment, intimidation that's occurred around these protests and counter-protests involving street fighting and even shootings. You in Wisconsin experienced a fatal shooting as a result of agitation and intimidation in Kenosha. And then this talk of a looming civil war. These people, actually believe that we're living in the times that civil war is imminent and that is coming. And then there's a lot of revenge and retaliation chatter surrounding the fatal shooting of a right-wing activist, Patriot Prayer supporter in Portland last year by an armed anarchist leftist, as well as the shooting of Ashley Babbitt at the U.S. Capitol, who was breaching the doorway, and one of the U.S. Capitol police officers fatally shot and killed her. So there's a lot of revenge, retaliation chatter surrounding these two deaths, and they're actually elevating these people into martyr figures. So the four broad things I saw last year that concern me about the far right is the attempted or actual ideologically motivated violence that we saw, as well as the nonviolent but visible presence, oftentimes with long guns and military style clothing in and around the protests, trying to agitate, harass, intimidate people. The disinformation efforts that we're going to talk about shortly, and most importantly, this engagement with law enforcement and the military, and even signs of infiltration of these institutions. This is just a kind of a sampling of the type of violence associated with the U.S. far right that we saw last year. It involved actual shootings, plots, vehicle ramming attacks, and also terrorist type plotting. So we had the far right, just by my count, and by no means is this an exhaustive, all-inclusive sampling, but just from my observation, I had at least 134 unique events across the country where we actually had either white supremacists or militia or somebody from the far right extremist movements at the social justice protests. 23 white supremacist events and 75 unique anti-government events. And then we had, a sampling of other general far right. And this is kind of a graphic depiction of where these, events occurred that had the far right presence. Just going a little bit into the disinformation efforts, non-publicly available or no publicly available evidence suggests a foreign actor involvement at this time. But we did have some press reporting that came out recently that a far right member in France sent like hundreds of thousands of dollars to some far right groups here in the United States prior to a lot of the social mobilization during the social unrest, as well as the Capitol insurrection that we saw. We also had the leader of a neo-Nazi terrorist organization called The Base, where a number of their members were arrested by the FBI on various firearms charges and terrorist plotting. He fled to Russia, where he sought asylum there. Some of these other disinformation efforts, we're talking about Antifa or Black Lives Matter coming into your town and looting and setting fires and rioting. There was actually a Twitter account that was spreading disinformation that was traced back and linked to an actual white supremacist group. We also had some white supremacists arrested in Texas for passing out Antifa and Black Lives Matter propaganda, trying to get people in that town turned against them. In Minneapolis, the guy that was seen dressed in black with a black umbrella, they finally ID'd him. He was smashing the windows of an AutoZone store at the very beginning of the George Floyd protests and riots that ensued in that city. He was later identified as a white supremacist member of the Aryan Cowboys gang. Moving on to this other concern of the far right linkages to law enforcement and the military. They've always had a history of these linkages. And I actually pointed that out in my 2009 assessment, and it drew quite a bit of criticism, particularly from the American Legion, because they thought that I was slandering veterans. I have a great love and respect for our veterans. I have family members that have served in the military. My own son is enlisted in the Navy. And I was only pointing out the fact that we have seen past returning veterans coming back from wars, whether it was the Vietnam War, the Gulf War. They come back to a society that may not accept them for as much as they had hoped. They may be suffering the mental or psychological effects of war. They might not be getting the necessary medical and psychological treatments that they need. They might not be able to find a job easily. So they have a problem reacclimating into society, and they become easy targets for a lot of these far-right extremist groups, because these extremist groups, they actively go out and recruit these military members, and they put them in positions of leadership in the militia movement. And they get them back into training with guns and teaching people all of that military skills and tradecraft that they learned and were taught. And so it kind of brings this satisfaction, acknowledgement that people appreciate them. And that's why they are easily susceptible to this type of recruitment. And plus, being engaged in this field training and live fire exercises gives those returning veterans that adrenaline rush that they once had on the battlefield or even in their own military training. So that just kind of, again, reinforces this environment in which, you know, they get attracted to and join and flourish in. So there were at least 10 cases that I counted during the civil unrest this summer that involved linkages between the far right and law enforcement. And I broke them down into 4 general types. We actually had infiltration. This is where members of law enforcement were actually members of extremist groups. There was also coordination, where we had video footage of law enforcement officers coordinating with the extremists on different things. Also support, shows of support and thanks given to extremists by law enforcement. And then finally, the 4th category is actually tipping them off to pending arrests or certain activities or certain areas to stay away from because the police activity was going to be focused on those areas. So this is a graphic depiction of these 10 incidents that I became aware of. There have been several more since the civil unrest kind of dissipated in the fall. But this is, goes to show you that these linkages exist, and it is a concern, because can you imagine if you had a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda that had linkages to highly trained U.S. military personnel and U.S. law enforcement? What type of boost in their violent capabilities would that provide? And one other point I'll make is George Washington University is tracking all of the arrests related to the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And to date, they've arrested close to 200 people, and 20% of those arrested are military service members. And there are at least 30 off-duty law enforcement officers that are being investigated by their respective departments who were present at the Capitol on that day and participated in the insurrection. Moving off to the far left, like I said, we have 3 major movements that have engaged in terrorism and acts of violence. That is the violent anarchist movement, the Black nationalists, and Antifa. But again, these movements are much smaller in comparison to their far right counterparts. So because of that, because the far right has much more lethal capability than far left, and just the fact that we've seen many more incidents by the far right as far as violence and killing people, that's why I consider the far right a much greater threat, and that's why we're going to be talking about them a lot more. But just to show a balanced approach, we are going to talk about the far left and the violence they've been engaged in. So one of the things that I observed towards the latter half of the summer's social unrest was this radicalization loop where we had both far right and far left kind of feeding off each other and radicalizing each other. So we initially have the far right bringing long guns to these protests. It's a sign of intimidation and fear and trying to assert their power and authority. Well, next thing we know, we have far leftists starting to arm themselves with long rifles.
We saw the formation of the No Effing Around Coalition Black Militia. Had over 120 people show up at Stone Mountain, Georgia, fully armed. The guns had ammunition fully loaded, and it was a show of force to show that, they're prepared and willing to assert their power and their cause as well. And so it leads to this potential arms race between these competing factions on both sides of the political spectrum. And when you have people bringing arms to protests and people's opinions are heated and they're in an environment where there's a lot of contention and chaos, I'm afraid that there's an increasing chance or risk of having shootings or even a shootout between these both sides. So we'll continue to see whether this phenomenon continues in 2021. I know a lot of states are also concerned. They're passing laws banning all weapons at protests, which I think is a good thing. But nevertheless, people will still conceal weapons and bring them into these protests. And there's always the potential that these tempers will flare in acts of violence against each other. So the far left's violence, as I said earlier, is predominantly focused on property and law enforcement rather than innocent civilians or faith-based communities, things like this. So we do have violent confrontations, physical confrontations, fighting, throwing objects at the police, setting fire to police cars, setting fires to businesses that they look at as symbols of capitalism, things of this nature. And like I said, that is a concern, and it has resulted in literally billions of dollars of destruction this summer. But we only had just a few isolated incidents where leftists actually committed violence against people, innocent civilians, like that Patriot Prayer activist that was gunned down in Portland. So in my observation, we had far left extremists present at 42 unique locations in 21 states. 28 were linked to the Black Bloc anarchists. We had at least 8 that had the Antifa folks present, and then 7 that had the Black nationalists present. Again, these numbers are not an accurate reflection, nor are they exhaustive, and they're most likely extremely low. But this is just based on the open source reporting that I was able to look at. One other thing to consider when it comes to far left extremists and terrorism, remember the FBI that typically opens about 900 domestic terrorism investigations per year opens over 600 just in the months of May and June 2020 alone. So their final count for the year was much higher than their average of 900. It exceeded 1,200 plus. And I suspect that many of those investigations are focused on far left violent extremists and terrorism that occurred under the guise of the social unrest that happened. And this is a graphic depiction of these far left extremists and the locations that they operated over the summer. I got to speed things up. So these are just a laundry list of incidents, primarily criminal acts and plotting, rioting, and arson activity that was linked back to anarchists and Black nationalists and Antifa. All right, so the near-term forecast, we're in a period of heightened risk, and these groups continue to operate at a heightened level. And I'm concerned going into 2021 that we not only have the far right that's going to continue to radicalize and recruit and be very active because of the Democratic administration that's in power, but also we have this far left that's kind of reemerged and asserted itself in 2020. So whether that continues to grow under a Biden administration is yet to be foreseen. If that does happen, we're going to be in for a really big fight, because we're going to have both far right and far left activists conducting acts of violence simultaneously and maybe even against each other. So some of the things that are fueling the continued growth, like I said, Democrats are in power now. That means, possible gun legislation being passed, immigration reform being laxed, rescinding the Muslim travel ban, these types of things. So it's basically a rollback of all the things the far right activists had fought for, and that will probably agitate them and upset some to carry out acts of violence. I don't believe COVID is going to be going away miraculously, even with the vaccine rollout. We've seen a number of variants already coming out that are, medical professionals are trying to keep pace with. So I think we're going to continue to see hotspots in the United States. And these protective measures, governor's orders being issued for, wearing masks and all the same things we experienced in 2020, we're just going to relive in 2021. And then, of course, like I said, this, looming election was stolen from former President Trump. We need to correct that. It's our civic duty. We're patriots. We're going to make sure that, that doesn't leave unaddressed. Even the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is propagated since 2017, that really led to a lot of this, resentment against Democrats and things like this, are saying, that President Trump's going to come back to the White House on March 4th. So it's got people's hopes up that that's going to happen. So when that doesn't happen, what are those people going to do? Are they going to finally realize that they're, following a false narrative, or are they going to actually say, well, I need to do something to make that happen? All right, so, we're dealing with the aftermath of the 2020 election. I don't think it's miraculously going to go away. What's former President Trump's influence on the far right now that he's out of office is yet to be seen. Is he going to form a new political party? Is he going to continue to pander and fan the flames of these far right groups with his social media and statements that he makes? Is he going to run again for president in 2024? So these are all things that kind of play into this heightened period of risk that we're going to be in for the next foreseeable future, for the next 4 years at least. So to close out my presentation, here's just a laundry list of recommendations. By no means is this exhaustive or complete, but just some ideas of what needs to be done to just start getting a handle on this threat and start combating it and trying to repel it. So it all starts with our elected officials. They need to watch what they say. The heated rhetoric needs to be toned down. They need to condemn acts of violence when it's ideologically motivated and call it terrorism, whether it's from the far left or the far right. Diminishing it, calling it a hate crime or the act of a crazed gunman, or minimizing it in that way, or just turning your blind eye to it doesn't help the problem. It only allows it to grow bigger. There also needs to be structural policing reform, particularly when it comes to, biases, racism within police departments, as well as this infiltration that I've talked about, showing support to one side at the expense of another. Law enforcement needs to remove extremists from within their ranks. People with these extremist views, in my opinion, shouldn't be policing our communities. Really calls into question their, level of judgment, their integrity. Who are they serving, whether it's the extremist organization or, the agency that they're employed by. And it also undermines public trust, the fact that you have extremist members of your police force. Like I mentioned, state laws that ban weapons at all protests, I think would be a good thing. I'm in favor of Dick Durbin's 2021 Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. This has no privacy, civil liberties concerns. It's not talking about a new law to punish and penalize people for domestic terrorism. All it is a piece of legislation that delineates responsibilities and roles among federal agencies, gets rid of the turf battles, gets everybody involved in the fight. And so I'm in favor of that. And if any of you have a chance, take a look at that piece of legislation. I think we need to develop anti-hate programs in our schools to teach our children about the dangers of extremism and hate, and as well as conspiracy theories, and how to be good consumers of information, and how to actually critically think when you're reading your information and do source comparison and, source analysis. Exit programs such as groups like Life After Hate, Free Radicals. These are people that used to belong or were members of extremist organizations that have now renounced those beliefs and have started organizations to try to give help to those who want to leave but are caught up in these extremist movements and beliefs. So I think we really need to put some money, time, and effort into those types of organizations and see how successful they are. As far as people, individuals, you can get involved and help with this problem by just reading about and trying to get a better understanding. The fact that you came to this presentation is a great thing for you to increase your understanding of the phenomena and to get smart on it. You could also write op-ed pieces for the newspaper about this issue. You can write letters to your state representatives as well as your congressmen and senators expressing your support for the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. It's also important that if you have family members or friends or coworkers, neighbors that you're close to that have embraced extremism or actually belong to an extremist group, it's human nature to want to ignore these people, to ostracize them, forget about them. But I would do just the opposite. I would love them, I would show compassion towards them, and I would be all-inclusive to try to get them reacclimated into productive activities and pull them away from the poisonous ideologies of these extremist movements. And I can tell you in my 40-year history of studying this topic, I don't know of a single case of an extremist that reformed themselves and renounced their beliefs that did not involve an act of love or compassion. So debating with these people, trying to send them to training to try to deprogram them or to show them the fallacies behind these beliefs doesn't work. It's through love, compassion, and inclusion. And so with that, I would like to close with a video to just drive the point home, and then we'll open up to questions and answers.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building.
The chaos in downtown Oklahoma City did indeed resemble Beirut after what police believe to be a 1,200-pound car bomb ripped through the 9-story federal building.
Terrorism is ideologically motivated violence.
In Beirut, Lebanon today, a pickup truck loaded with explosives drove to the American embassy, and there was a tremendous explosion there during the lunch hour.
There needs to be some sort of belief system behind the violence.
The death toll here rose today to 22 when a gunman opened fire in this Walmart store just right here.
And you're trying to instill fear in society or change government policy. Once again, here we are with another mass shooting in America that's been perpetrated by a white nationalist.
The El Paso incident is now the 7th deadliest mass shooting in the nation's history.
In fact, there have been more arrests and deaths in the United States caused by domestic terrorists than international terrorists in recent years.
Back in 2009, I wrote a report about the rise of right-wing extremism with the combination of the unprecedented election of an African-American president that, coupled with the downturn in the economy, just created this fertile ground for recruiting extremists into the far-right movements. We all thought we had done a great service to the country and sent out this prescient warning. So it was a big surprise when I came to the office on Monday and saw my report all over the conservative news.
The Department of Homeland Security, Dr. Dobson, is warning law enforcement officials about the rise in right-wing extremist activity.
Isn't it interesting that the media has jumped all over this when there aren't any examples of it? There are no Timothy McVeighs out there right now. They're making a big deal out of something that hasn't happened and may not happen.
Supporters of reproductive rights are mourning the killing of the abortion provider, Dr. George Tiller.
It is a building now with glasses may have got inside
with a gun and there were shots fired.
An investigation is underway in Colorado following a deadly attack on a Planned Parenthood facility.
A Wednesday night Bible study erupts in gunshots. At the scene, 8 are pronounced dead, 6 females, 2 males. Another man dies later in the hospital.
I do consider myself a white supremacist, sure.
So when we have Democrats in power, typically the far right gets very agitated because they're fearful of minority rights being expanded. They're also fearful of pending gun legislation or outright gun ban. What makes this unique is the fact that we have a Republican administration, and yet these far right groups are still operating at a very heightened level. This goes against all the trending data that I've looked at in the past 40 years.
Far-right attacks in Europe jumped 43% between 2016 and 2017. In the U.S., right-wing extremists were linked to at least 50 murders last year. That's a 35% increase over 2017.
The reason why it's different this time is going back to the 2016 presidential election. The president started dehumanizing his opponents. When he got elected, he started dehumanizing the media.
A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
Democrats, people of color, people that are of the Muslim faith, even immigrants, using terms like invaders and rodents.
What's happening right now as a large group of people, they call it a caravan. That is an assault on our country. That's an assault.
They feed right into these extremist narratives who've been doing that for decades. And Trump has actually mainstreamed some of their ideas. Things like a border wall, things like travel ban on Muslims, mass deportation of immigrants.
The wall would stop it, okay? The wall would stop it. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's not. That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that.
These were themes that I saw on KKK and neo-Nazi websites 15 years ago, and now they're being put forth for policy.
Only in the panhandle.
This threat got ahead of us. It's grown year after year for the past decade.
You're saying that AME was charged with domestic terrorism, Dylan Roof.
So you're using the word charge. So as I said before, there's no domestic terrorism charge like 18 U.S.C. 2339 A, B, C, D for a foreign terrorist organization.
Is white supremacy not a global issue?
It is a global issue.
So why are they not charged with foreign?
Because the United States Congress doesn't have a statute for us for domestic terrorism like we do on a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab.
Having such a statute would give investigators an extra tool in the toolbox to add penalty enhancements, which may be a deterrent to some people. The internet is a force multiplier. It enables people in the privacy of their homes to connect with like-minded individuals. This leads to more emboldened radical activities. People are basically copycatting other extremist attacks throughout the world here in America. We're determined today to stop this threat. It's going to take years to slow down the momentum and growth of these movements. We need to make a decision now that we're going to draw a line in the sand and do what we can to stem this tide of hate.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation, Daryl. It was thorough and left us with a lot of questions. And so in that regard, I just want to say to everybody, please do type your questions into the chat or into the Q&A. We have several great student staff who are working through those and are compiling them, and they will ask them on your behalf. So I know that a couple of you have used the raise hand feature, but that doesn't actually do any good in this format. So if you would put those into the chat or into the Q&A, we will pass them on your behalf. And before we turn to those, to the questions from our wider audience, I want to turn to two of our most astute observers here on campus. Dr. Wendy Scattergood is an assistant professor of political science, and she teaches on political extremism. And likewise, Dr. Ángel Saavedra Cisneros, another assistant professor of political science, teaches on political identities and political psychology. And we've invited them to offer the first questions, and then we'll go to the rest from our audience. And I just want to say to everybody as well, if you're watching the time, Daryl has graciously agreed to extend his time with us, so the clock is not going to run out here. So Angel and Wendy, welcome. And Wendy, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Daryl, for being with us. I really appreciate that. And thanks to the audience for being here and looking forward to your questions. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to do one right now, so let everybody get a chance here. So the Department of Defense has recently talked about recognizing that some of the radicalization that we're seeing is happening while they're in active military service. And so that they're going to take some actions to try to stop some of these practices and root some of that out. But I'm wondering about how maybe those folks a little bit lower down in the chain of command are going to respond to this. And what's your sense of maybe how effective that is going to be?
Well, this is good news. I actually worked for the U.S. Army as a civilian for 8 years and became keenly aware of this connection between, military service members and extremist groups. And even the military's been targeted by extremist groups like militias and stuff for terrorist plotting. So anyways, the U.S. Army, and I'm probably assume DOD's policies on extremism are old and outdated. They limit it to white nationalists. Active participation is the wording that they use. This was, I guess, a good policy for the 1970s and 80s. But with the advent of the internet and with the diversification of these groups, they're no longer quote unquote groups per se. A lot of them exist as movements and ideologies. And so I think that the DoD needs to seriously consider expanding upon the existing prohibition against extremist active participation to not only white supremacy, but also other forms of extremism that have histories of violence, such as the militia movement, also sovereign citizens, Black nationalists. So that's one thing that they can do to close these loopholes and also get rid of the term active participation. Because what does that mean? Does that mean I have to pay money and get a membership card to a group? Does that mean I have to show up to a rally and participate that way? Or is it, participating actively in the privacy of my home on the internet and, sharing messages on the message board and, things like that. So we need to really update that policy, bring it into, the year 2021 and expand the scope of it. So that would be my recommendation for DoD to start. And when we start with that, then we can start purging active duty military members, as well as preventing those who are applying to be part of the military, from entering and getting that training. And I would highly recommend Matt Kennard's book, The Irregular Army, which gives a really good account of several case studies and interviews with high-ranking military officials about these policies and about extremists within the ranks of the military.
Angel, can I just follow up really quick? Sorry. So I guess one of the, and I heard that that's the policy that they're going to do is to purge them and to do more with the recruitment process at the very beginning to try to root some of those folks out. And, as you were talking about the solutions to this, I think one of the things that I worry about with that purge process is that, if you're kicking them out, then seems to me that you're just sending them right out to these groups to belong to as they no longer have a home within the military. And so, is there maybe another solution that might work better for that?
So just like they do with, men and women returning back from war zones, a lot of times they don't get the necessary follow-up and treatment from the VA and other institutions. You need to take this and carry the burden all the way home. Okay, get therapy for these people. Get them a psychological eval. Get them the help that they need, the love and compassion that I talked about. Put them in, as in one of these exit programs where they can talk about their concerns and their grievances with others who used to be members of these groups but have now renounced it, and give them a new network of support. So that's so very important. We can't just, purge these people and then expect them to survive and renounce these beliefs and reform on their own. They're going to need help from other people, and we need to follow through with any and all programs that do that.
Hi, Daryl. Thanks for your presentation. Really thought-provoking. I have two thoughts, and I think one is a question on how to resolve things. So the first thought that I have is here at St. Norbert, we have some, like a credo that we say. We have a civility statement, and among the things that we suggest is that everyone who comes here to study or teach needs to actively oppose intolerance, and everyone needs to practice radical hospitality. And those two things sometimes might seem at odds, right? Because if someone is being intolerant and we are to actively oppose it, how do we also share this radical hospitality and this warmth? And so I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit of how to deal with this. And the question, and the other question, the other thought, is this idea of the people who are involved in these extremist groups. Some, like when we think of foreign extremism, we tend to think of religious extremists. But in the US, what is the basis of their identity? So is it a white America? Is it an America that only serves a few people? Or how is it that, these people who swore to protect the Constitution, the country, people in the military, somehow shift their own identity to say, no, I'm no longer protecting this country unless this country satisfies this belief that I have. And you see this, in many groups. So I'm curious, either one of those, where does that identity go? What is its basis? Or also, how do we resolve the problem, not the problem, the conflict between opposing intolerance and then practicing radical hospitality?
I think we could have a whole nother 2-hour discussion just on those two topics that you just proposed. Going to your point on radical hospitality, okay, I don't expect the victims and their families to go and love and show compassion to these people that have harmed their loved ones, okay? It's incumbent upon the family, the close friends who know this person intimately to take that responsibility and to extend that hospitality. So also Republicans, okay? The Democrats, no matter how determined and sincere they may be, when they come out and say they're going to combat this problem and solve it and whatnot, all it's going to do is push the fear and paranoia of these extremists even further. So it's going to take leadership on the part of conservatives and Republicans like myself to call out this threat and to take a leading role in implementing policies and strategies to deal with it effectively. It's only when the own conservative family and Republicans come out and do that will we ever make great strides in putting this problem back, setting it back. Going to your second point, a lot of times people are attracted and get indoctrinated and turned into extremists because of their own personal life experiences. And I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a behavioral analyst, but I have talked to people in those professions and got kind of a basic understanding of how the human dynamics work and why people get attracted to these ideologies, embrace them, and get mobilized to the point of doing things that many close family members and friends wouldn't even envision them doing. And it all starts with a personal life crisis. Okay, whether it's being laid off at a job, being divorced, having the death of a child or a close family member, not being able to pay your taxes, or any other host of issues, personal or financial, that opens the doorway for people to start seeking new truths or answers to their life problem. And extremism is a very easy way of explaining these very complex problems that people may have and giving a scapegoat for these problems. So people latch on to these easy explanations and these scapegoats to avenge these grievances, these deep-seated personal grievances that they have. We saw this in the 1980s during the farm crisis. Another really good book I would recommend is Joel Dyer's Harvest of Rage, which I'm about to summarize for you. But what we had was the American family farm came under fire in the 1980s because there was this rapid drop in crop prices. And a lot of these farms went bankrupt and were bought up by these big banks in New York City and, you know, San Francisco and other places. Then you had these corporate farms that kind of got rolled out. Well, the anti-government white supremacist groups went to these farm auctions and gave speeches about how the, you know, secret Jewish cabal back in New York City was secretly manipulating these crop prices and causing these family farms to go bankrupt with the sole intent of taking their land and turning them into these businesses where they could profit off of it. Well, there was a number of farmers that killed themselves when they heard that news. There's a number of farmers that joined what was called the Posse Comitatus, one of the first anti-government violent tax resistor groups. There was a number of law enforcement ambushes that happened during the 80s because of this. So it just goes to show you how something like that could be exploited by these extremists and manipulated to the point of, you know, changing the minds and the will of these people who are vulnerable. And so once you have the extremist belief in place, I always say you're already halfway to becoming a terrorist at this point, because you already got the belief system that justifies the violence. You've got the targets that you need to, you know, avenge your grievances against. You're put in an environment where you could get the necessary training and whatnot, strategies and how to conduct the attack. And so all that's lacking is a catalyst. What's going to cause you to finally snap and cross over that line from law-abiding activity to unlawful activity? And again, it could be something as, you know, simple as a court notice arriving in the mail, you know, because you're going to foreclose on your house and the bank sends you a notice that they're going to foreclose on it. It could be any number of things, but basically you've got this life crisis that happens, extremist beliefs are introduced, and then a triggering event happens, which causes these people to go on the path to violence.
So in that regard, I saw a note in the Washington Post today that the individuals who were arrested so far out of the January 6th violence at the Capitol had on average about twice the national average of significant financial trouble. Foreclosures, lost properties, things like that. There were business owners, there were people with white collar jobs. They say only 1/10 or so were aligned with identified groups like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers. But there was a really substantial uptick in terms of financial trouble. Does that fit what you're describing then?
I think that's a great illustration of my point. Whenever we have economic downturns, people get laid off work. It creates these big pools of people that these extremists can go fishing and draw people out of these pools. You have pools of people that are gullible, okay, people that fall for scams or, you know, things like that. You have the financially desperate, people that are underwater on their homes or their, you know, credit card debt exceeds, you know, the limits of them ever recovering or from that. You have people that, you know, there's people that have, you know, general anti-government sentiment. Doesn't mean you're an extremist. You know, maybe our taxes in your county are high. You know, maybe they're, you know, are a burden. And so there's some legitimate points to that. So there's people that have, you know, some anti-government sentiment, but it hasn't radicalized or become extreme in nature. And then you just have the criminal element. People join these groups with the sole intent of, you know, conducting criminal activity and even scamming people into these conspiracies and paying money to learn how to be a sovereign citizen, things like this. So yeah, hard financial times, you know, people are out of work, they're bored, they're looking, you know, around to different solutions, and extremism is just one of those things that's out there that they can easily latch onto. And unfortunately, a lot of people have. An interesting study out of the United Kingdom, I forget what the company's name was, but when the pandemic first started, they began to monitor and internet search terms that started, they were monitoring it before the pandemic, but they were particularly interested in what type of impact would the pandemic have on these, global internet searches. And in the United States, things like white supremacy and, other types of extremist terms shot up, 40, 50, 60%, even higher than that. And there were actually certain locales in the United States that had, higher percentages than other locales. So that does show you that when people are idle and out of work and, their routines are cut back or curtailed, people are going to be searching the internet and, being introduced to all kinds of things. And these conspiracy theories and these extremist movements are just one of many things that people will search and stumble across.
Today, a lot of us have been riveted by the impeachment trial as that's been broadcast, and seeing some of the new video footage and things like that. And I know that some of our audience have asked questions about that. I think first up from Hattie Krushek, who is a senior majoring in global business and with a peace and justice minor, one of our staff at the Norman Mailer Center. I think Hattie has one of those questions for us.
I do. Thank you, Daryl, for being here. I know I've been really impacted by this presentation so far, so I'm excited that I get to ask you some of the questions. So someone from the audience said, what do you feel will be the impact on the right-wing extremist groups if Donald Trump is acquitted of impeachment? What impact do you see if he is convicted?
So obviously, if he's acquitted, I think it'll be just a minor near-term relief to these types of people. In their heart of hearts, they believe that Donald Trump was forced out of office, through voter fraud, a rigged election, what have you. That's what the, true believers are thinking. If he is convicted, then I think it'll have a more powerful effect on motivating people towards more extremism and more violence to try to avenge that perceived injustice. So, we'll have to wait and see. And like I said, the former president's influence on these groups cannot be overlooked or underestimated. And to see what type of effect he has on these people now that he's out of office is going to be intriguing and interesting. And I think that deplatforming the president off Twitter and Facebook was a very good thing. In fact, one newspaper outlet reported that disinformation about voter fraud and the rigged election went down 70+% of internet chatter and search terms once the president's social media platforms were deplatformed.
Wow. Okay, next up we have Bethany Krecklow with one of the audience questions. Bethany is another one of our student staff, and her major is history education. She's a first-year student. Bethany, where are you?
Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and for answering these questions. The one I have for you is, in which ways and methods do we use and have used love, passion, and inclusion to help growing concerns of domestic terrorism?
It's a great follow-up question. I'll give you a few that I know of. We've had white supremacists imprisoned for felony, firearms charges, for beating people, for shooting people. Some of these people renounced their white supremacist beliefs when they were attacked in prison by a bunch of black inmates who you think would have caused them to hate even more. But it was only a black inmate that came to this person's aid in his time of hurt and need. And so he renounced his beliefs, pretty much after that event and became friends with this inmate. Another one was a convicted felon having a hard time finding a job. The only person that would hire him was a Jewish man who overlooked the swastika tattoos and hate symbols tattooed on this man and gave him a job and showed him that no, Jews are not inherently evil, conniving, greedy type people, that they're actually loving and that they're willing to employ you. There have been others who have met women of color and fallen in love and renounced their beliefs. George Birdie's a good example of that. So those are some of the stories that I'm aware of. There's a lot more. Interesting enough, there hasn't been enough research and study in this area, so that would be a great project for anybody to seek some grant funding and start looking into and talking to these exit programs on how acts of love have caused people to leave the movement, or acts of compassion that have been showed towards them. But I don't know of a single example where somebody debated their beliefs and the person decided to renounce it based on a debate.
The story of Derek Black and his book, what is it, Rising Up from Hate or Upward from Hate, such a great illustration of that. Growing up in the context of this whole white nationalist movement, being so involved in Stormfront, I think it was, right? And then people just persistently befriending him in the context of a college campus. Really, really remarkable story. So next up with another audience question is Morgan Christensen. Morgan is a junior sociology and psychology major and another one of our student staff. So Morgan, go ahead.
Hi, Daryl. Thanks for being with us again. Great presentation. So my question is, why has no one exposed Q, who that is, how the person or persons are operating? Additionally, in regards to media, to what extent do you believe that media outlets that function as educators and shapers of public opinion would be responsible for propagating or spreading this hate?
Yeah, this is another really excellent question. So I'm happy to tell you that Q has been exposed. There was a media outlet that followed the trail, the online internet trail, to 3 individuals and have actually named them and gave them an opportunity to kind of explain themselves, which they refused to do. But my thoughts are, it's funny, or, you think this is a joke or a prank, or, you think you're trying to inspire people to do things. Just remember that there are people out there who may be mentally deranged or just might have very strong beliefs, and they may act violently based on these conspiracy theories that you're propagating. So, I'll turn it over to the lawyers to deal with that. There's probably nothing we can do from a criminal standpoint, but definitely I think they should follow up on maybe possible civil penalties or public outing, deplatforming, things of this type that we could, hold these people accountable for their actions. So QAnon, so far, I mean, the FBI has declared the QAnon conspiracy theory as a domestic terrorist threat. And, there have been people that have acted out on these QAnon conspiracy theories and actually, issued threats, shot up a pizza place in DC, parked an armored vehicle on the Hoover Dam and threatened to blow up the Hoover Dam. There's actually a woman in Texas that murdered her husband and kidnapped her child. They were divorced. She was a QAnon follower and thought the husband was involved in these false allegations of sex trafficking, and that the Democratic leadership are these secret child molesters and international sex traffickers and things of this nature. That's what motivated a North Carolina man to go up and shoot up this pizza place, is because this QAnon conspiracy said that the Democrats were meeting at this Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C., and that there was actually a dungeon with children being held there. And of course, after going in and shooting up the place and thinking he was going to rescue these children, the perpetrator was probably very disappointed to find out there was no dungeon and there were no Democrats there at the pizza parlor. So, those are just some examples. I'm sure there's many others of how people have been enthralled with this QAnon conspiracy theory to the point of going crazy and actually committing acts of violence. And we should, hold people like that accountable in any way that we can, civilly, through public shaming, like I said, deplatforming their sites, things of this nature.
When you think about holding them accountable, one of the things that we see with the online proliferation of these groups is that, everybody's signed up for surveillance capitalism with our Facebook pages and everything else. We've willingly surrendered all kinds of data. And now that is being used by law enforcement for tracking and surveillance. And in many cases, we're grateful for that. But it does seem like a genie that's very difficult to put back in the bottle. So when you think about surveillance, when you think about the surrender of data, any suggestions for the new administration about how we would go forward from here? And then I'll throw it right after this back to Wendy Scattergood and Anhel if they have additional questions. But what do you think about this whole thing with surveillance? Can we undo this, or we just take it and do what we can with it?
Well, I'm happy to say that when it comes to the U.S. government collecting data, there are a lot of regulations, restrictions, and even monitoring and checks and balances that are put into place. So just to kind of give you an inside look at the type of scrutiny that I had at the Homeland Security Department that I was willing to do because it was part of my job. We had an intelligence oversight program for the whole intelligence community. Okay, this is Presidential Executive Order 12333. It was passed in light of the student protests back in the 60s that were infiltrated by the military. And basically what intelligence oversight says that, you have to have an agency mission that clearly outlines the purpose of why you're collecting that information. And you just can't hold on to it indefinitely, okay? You have to justify year after year why you maintain that information. Now, if it's in the public domain, then that's more fair game. But I'm talking about law enforcement reporting through sources and intelligence documents, things of this nature. So I was subjected to annual mandatory intelligence oversight training. I had an annual inspection that was pre-planned, but also there was a spot inspection that was not planned, that could just be unannounced on any day, just like a random drug test. You come in the office, all your files, electronic and hard copy, are going to be inspected today. So that keeps you honest, prevents any abuses that are occurring, because if you do get caught with violating these intelligence oversights, there's various administrative disciplinary measures that can be taken, including termination of employment, depending on how egregious the violation is. So not only that, you have the privacy office that's always, subjecting you to, why do you have this person's social security number, or why do you have this person's date of birth, or things like this. And so we were taught and ingrained to try to minimize what's called PII in our files. If we don't have a need for a social security number, then we get rid of it. And we also had civil rights and civil liberties attorneys that also gave training and reviewed all of our finished intelligence reports for anything that might be, a violation of someone's civil rights or civil liberties. So that's just a handful of things that I had to go through, in my career. But with the private sector, they don't have those restrictions. Okay, Facebook and Twitter, LexisNexis, all these big, corporations that basically make money and profit off of gathering of information, they don't have these restrictions. So if you need to be concerned about someone that's got your information and may have the potential to misuse it, you need to be looking at those private entities more than the government. That's always been a concern, is that a government agency, if given new authorities, would unfairly unleash those authorities on certain groups and not others. And we've had some clear examples of that. And once those violations and of trust, as well as violations of law, were found, people were held accountable for it. So, that's something that we always have to consider when we do look at new legislation, look at all the pros and cons, self-reflect on, what's being gained and what's being lost, and make sure that we have much more to be gained from whatever's being passed than what the consequences could be.
All right. Really appreciate that. I think I trust you more than Zuckerberg. So probably have ample reason for that. Wendy, you said you have something ready for us here.
Yeah, this is actually just a follow on what we were just talking about. And that is, we're in an age now where the social media companies are the ones that are to some extent regulating our speech rights. And so that puts us in a different kind of environment. So I was thinking, in 1977, 1978 in Skokie, right, where the neo-Nazis groups wanted to march down the neighborhood of Skokie where many Holocaust survivors lived. And the ACLU, and in fact, a Jewish lawyer in the ACLU actually defended the rights both of speech and assembly for the neo-Nazis to do it. Now, they didn't end up doing it. They did a rally in downtown Chicago instead. But, right, he was arguing that this is a fundamental speech right. And so as we've seen the closing down of Parler, we've seen Twitter shutting down certain accounts. Obviously, we just talked about the president's account being shut down. I mean, these are effective regulations on speech rights that are being done by private companies. So where do you, and we talk about every generation having to make this decision of, sort of protecting the public and, that part of the radicalization process that happens by things that are readily available to people can start you down that rabbit hole. And so there is the argument to be made that, we need to kind of muzzle those things. But then you've got to balance it with our right, particularly for political speech, to allow these opposing viewpoints to be out there. So do you see, what's your sense of where that line is in protecting free speech, but also, protecting the public from this radicalization process?
So I co-authored an article last year that argued for not to deplatform or muzzle these people for multiple reasons. Not only because it's their right to hate, but also when you do that, all you're doing is relocating a problem to another area of the internet, which we might not have as much visibility on and can't monitor. And it's also creating an environment where these people don't feel like they have a mechanism to voice their grievances. And so I think that's also an important thing, is that we should all have the ability, if we have a concern or a grievance, to be able to express that openly. So I'm against deplatforming, except for limited cases like Donald Trump. If you have a proliferator, a single individual that is causing major, has a major following and is pushing out a lot of disinformation that's radicalizing people and things of this nature, then of course it makes sense to shut that person down, at least give them a cooling off period, try to explain to them the harms that they're doing. So in those types of isolated incidents, I would say it's effective. And the fact that we had 70% drop in the number of people searching for and talking about the rigged election is kind of a testament to how effective shutting somebody down like a Donald Trump. One other thing that kind of comes to mind is rather than policing or censoring people's free speech, this is a more difficult path to pursue. I mean, obviously, deleting somebody's account is the easiest and least costly of the alternatives. But maybe we could develop a system similar to like the Better Business Bureau's stamp of approval for legitimate businesses, that you would strive for your website and its content to get this seal of approval to show that you are a trusted source of information. These companies could issue things. Twitter does that to Twitter accounts. Facebook has done that. Online dating sites have put these little verification symbols on people's profiles because they've had, their pictures taken, and facial recognition technology has matched this individual and shows it's the same person. So maybe some of those types of ideas could be applied to web content. But most importantly, I think we need to start with our youth and also just market and train people how to be responsible consumers of information. Okay, because literally there's so much information out there. It's up to us to determine what's true and not true, and what's a credible source and what's not. So maybe, if we do implement an anti-hate program in our schools, both secondary schools as well as colleges and universities, that could be part of the curriculum, is how to teach students and the next generation on how to differentiate between, InfoWars and CNN or some other, trusted mainstream source. So I think, those are some solutions to that problem and avoids the censorship issue. And like I said, I think that does more harm than good.
If I can put in a plug for a program that we have coming up, seems far, far away in October, October 5th, our Miller Lecture with Nadine Strawson, past president, longtime president of the ACLU, will focus on resisting hate through free speech, not censorship. And so using counter speech to respond to misinformation. Bethany, you say you have another audience question for us.
Yes,
and
I do.
By the way, just to give you a heads up, Daryl, we'll only keep you a little bit longer, just a couple more questions. Thanks so much for doing this. Bethany, go ahead.
Okay, so this kind of ties into the education aspect. Somebody asked, do you believe that the introduction of violent video games at a young age plays a role in a person's thought or decision-making process that might lead to acts of violence?
Well, that's a controversial subject in and of itself. My personal opinion is you immerse yourself in violence, you're going to become, accustomed to it, numb to it. So, it's already been proven that violent first-person shooter video games is the equivalent of, going to the range and, to a military school and learning these types of tactics. In fact, these first-person shooter games originated from military technology to teach our soldiers how to shoot more proficiently and how to, engage the enemy and stuff like this. So these virtual games do have an effect on a person's ability to inflict lethal force onto people with more proficiency. And we've seen that manifest itself in some of these young shooters at these schools that, are able to go in and kill as many people. I mean, Adam Lanza is a perfect example of this. The kid that shot all the young children at Sandy Hook. Okay, he was an avid first-person shooter. Never, he went to the range with his mother, so he did have some, experience with firearms, but not to the level of the video gaming. And that's what the video gaming taught him, and that's why he was able to kill so many children so quickly.
Okay, Morgan.
So one audience member asks, Canada added white supremacists and Proud Boys to their list of terrorist organizations. What would it take for the US to do the same? Although naming the organization as a terrorist organization will not necessarily cease the violence, why is our own government so slow to stop the known predators of homegrown terrorists?
That's a very astute observation, okay? So the United States, for the reasons I told you, does not maintain a domestic terrorism group list. Number one, these people adhere to leaderless resistance and lone offender tactics. So there's no, Al-Qaeda of domestic terrorism in America. Number two, let's say we do name some groups as domestic terrorists, okay? The KKK, they've killed thousands of people throughout its history. Why don't we name the KKK as a domestic terrorist group for the thousands of people they've killed over, the 100 and some odd years it's existed? The moment you do that, the KKK will change its name to something else. It'll be the same individuals under a new banner, a new name, and now you got to go through this bureaucratic process of updating your group list year after year after year, endlessly. And really, what do you gain from it? When you name a person as a domestic terrorist, okay, you can start surveilling them for no reason. You can, not no reason, you got broader surveillance authorities because they're a terrorist organization. You can do all kinds of things, but I would argue we could do the same things if we commit ourselves to long-term undercover investigations instead of just these in and outs, people going in, to a particular organization and baiting them with inert weapons and doing these sting operations within days, weeks, or months. There was a great program that the Missouri Highway Patrol instituted after the murders of 2 of their state troopers back in the 80s by white supremacists. They committed themselves and their department to a 25-year undercover investigation into the white supremacist movement in Missouri to root out potential cop killers. Do you mind thinking about, the level of commitment? Okay, this guy was there for 25 years of his life in white supremacy, doing this work because of his fellow officers in honor of their deaths. How much he sacrificed. His wife went along with it, which is good, so he didn't have to, be alone during this whole time. But I admire things like that, and I think there's good things that come of those types of investigations because the relationships of trust that someone builds over years of time of being with these people and knowing their personalities, knowing that one person is all talk and no action, and where another person's a lot more discreet and a lot more militant. So that threat assessment process could really turn in some great value by committing to those long-term undercover investigations. So I think that would have, a good effect is, have resolve to recommit ourselves to those types.
So I'll close with this one, Daryl. Your book was disturbing. It was hard to read, or in my case, to listen to. I listened to it on Audible. It was hard just hearing the breadth of these organizations, groups that are ideologically connected, but organizationally independent. And to see sometimes how much havoc, how much destruction can be brought about so quickly in an individual's life, in a community's life. And the kind of work, the work the undercover work you're describing that takes place over decades, the analysis that you do that takes place over decades, where you're watching, listening. Your recommendations, which are wonderful, and I took screenshots of those so we can keep those and continue working with them. It seems that the solutions take so much longer than the destruction. It's not a game of whack-a-mole. It's prairie dogs all over the Midwest, all over the country. It seems out of control. And so with that, it's easy to see all of this and be disturbed, to be a little bit frightened, to be disconsolate about the prospects of ever really getting it under control. But you give your life to this. And so my hunch is you see it as worth it. And you see how we can be turning it around. So if you would close with just a word of hope for us, what should we be watching for that would make us feel like we're really making progress on all this?
So I'd like to say a couple of things. Number one, this is a very dark subject. It weighs on my soul every time I open up a piece of literature and read through it and read the hatefulness and the false accusations and everything. It took a toll on me. After 20 years of doing this, I had to withdraw from it and heal myself to regain my balance and be grounded. I found myself sometimes starting to think like these people because I immersed myself so much in their propaganda. But day after day, year after year, I came into work I had others that supported me, my team of analysts, my management, things of this nature that, we'd have an arrest made or a plot that got thwarted. So that gave me a level of satisfaction that kind of offset all the doom and gloom aspects. There is a threat fatigue that sets in because you go in every day and you've got a list of things you want to do, but as soon as you get into the office, there's a dozen things that have happened overnight that are fires that need to be put out immediately. And so you get tired of that. Like I said, it just weighs on you. And it took me 2 years to kind of withdraw from this and recover and then kind of regain my strength and go at it again. So that's just a piece of advice to everyone. Take this in small doses, do what you can. Many hands make light work, so to speak, that old Chinese proverb. But some happy things, some optimistic things that I see. Number one is last year, we started seeing private think tanks and academia stepping up and filling the voids and the intelligence gaps and the information gaps in government. More and more people I see on the news are developing expertise in this area. So that gives me hope, the fact that we have so many people. I get contacted on a weekly basis from people who have a desire to fight against hate and extremism, and they want to be employed by my company. My company's one person, it's me. So I don't have this massive staff. I don't have any federal grants that are funding my research or anything like that. I just do it because I have a passion for it. And God called me to do this type of work ever since I was a young kid. I had a yearning, and as fate would have it, doors would open time and again that led me into this career and led me into being in this position today to be here speaking to you and to write those books and to do all the media appearances. Never in my life, when I signed up for government service, did I think I would stand before the lights and the camera and talk about this. This was work that I did in secret. Only my partner knew about what I was doing at work to a certain extent, but even a lot of things she didn't know because she didn't have a need to know or the clearance to know. Another thing that brings me hope is the fact that we've got more and more people talking about this on the media. We've got people calling and asking the right questions of our politicians, trying to get clarity on this issue. Our newly elected president has asked the intelligence community to do the very first comprehensive intelligence assessment of the domestic terrorist threat and gave them 2 months or 3 months to do it. Like I said, we got a piece of legislation being proposed that I think's been long overdue, Dick Durbin's Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which tells the FBI, yes, you're the lead agency on domestic terrorism. No one's going to steal that limelight from you, but Homeland Security has a role to play. So does ATF. So does the Marshals Service. So do all these other federal agencies. And this is what we want all of you to do for the betterment of the country. So those are some things that in these exit programs, like I said, I think they're going to do great work. And the more we invest in those programs, I think we're going to see the fruits of the labors. We've already seen it in Europe. Europe has done this for 20 years now. Okay, they're that far ahead of us, and they've told us the progress that they've made. Places like Germany, Sweden, Norway, other places, even the UK. So America's behind on that, but I think it's a viable program, and we need to put resources and money into it and bear the fruits and results. And also, I believe in the country, just American people. Yeah, it's easy to watch the news and see all the evilness and bad that's in the world, but believe me, there's more good going on than bad. And I tell my mother all the time, unplug the TV, take a break, and you'll see a whole brighter world out there. So I would encourage all of you to do that. I've done it myself, and it's been a wonderful thing. I used to be a consumer of the evening news every day, night after night, night after night. And now I've taken a break from it. I only watch it sparingly, and I feel so much greater for it. And I have much more time to serve and help others. So That's my advice, and that's a positive note to end on, I think.
Most definitely. So thank you so much for your service to all of us, for all of us. Thank you for being with us tonight and for giving us so much extra time. Also want to thank our other panelists, Angel Saavedra Cisneros and Wendy Scattergood, Jim Handley from Wisconsin Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, our students who so ably handled all those questions and distilled them into small bits, Morgan, Bethany, and Hattie. And thanks also to Jill Olson doing everything so beautifully behind the scenes. I also want to thank once again Masood Akhtar, who brought this program to us here at the Wisconsin Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Masood's organization is called We Are Many United Against Hate, and may that indeed be so. So thank you all